is a great deal of imagination. The question really becomes, how far can you stretch the imagination in such a way as this becomes a work of fiction rather than a work of fact? But it does have merit. Question? Good. All right. Now, handy thesis note number 107, the thesis proposal worksheet, can be used for a project or anything else for that matter, likewise. And it's basically a template. It leads you through. It leads you through the steps that you should be thinking through. And at the end, we have an example of handy thesis note being submitted to an advisor by one of the students who's in the room at the moment. I asked him to, fill it in. And he did a pretty good job. So I thought you might like to see, the responses, how that was crafted. What's the topic do you want to explore, and why do you consider it important? Now we'll come back to considerations of importance, because you're going to state that up front in your introduction, as we'll see. Who is your audience? Well, it's not just your mother or your father, right? Who is your audience? Well, in the answer that is provided at the end, there will be three groups of people that may be interested in my research. Scholars focusing on cultural routes study, especially Chinese cases. Historic preservation is concerned about Chinese historical preservation practice. And common people who care about the tea road developed by the merchants. Okay? So there is an audience. Now the reason we raise that right from the get-go is that you have to begin to understand how you're going to write this work. We often think of ourselves writing for ourselves, right? Well, here I am, right? And I'm writing for myself. Well, that's not exactly the way in which planners make themselves terribly effective, right? The audience that you should be addressing, right, should extend beyond yourself, and certainly beyond the chair of your special committee, lovely person though he might be, or she be. Okay? So think about the audience, because it'll help you frame the nature of your questions. Okay? Then, what questions or hypotheses would you like to investigate or address in relationship to this particular topic? What literature have you examined which directly deals with the problem? Notice I underline directly. Reading the newspaper can be useful, but it may not directly have a relevance. So you can't use that as the procrastination necessary to do your thesis. Right? Sorry. In what ways, if any, will you propose a study be similar to previous works in literature that you have discovered? In doing your literature search, you'll find stuff that is material which is similar to what it is that you want to do. And you say, oh, can't do that topic. Somebody else has done it. No, 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 no. That's not the answer. You will create your own body of material. You will create your interpretation. Your mind is not going to come to the same conclusions, not address the issues in any of the same way. Right? That's pretty clear. You as an individual have something to contribute, and more particularly, even if all of that weren't true, it's your work. So the question of someone having done previous work is to inform you, to study the methodology, to understand the sources, but to read them and review them for yourself to what degree they're useful. There are any number of instances when I've been writing a book. As some of you know, I wrote a book on pop culture, of all things, right? Pop culture. And I come across a dissertation on hop culture that is written in the state of California, Berkeley. And I say to myself, oh, this is interesting. Here I'm writing a book and they write a dissertation. The dissertation is in one little corner of California, right? Yuba County. Well, Yuba County is important, but it wasn't the entire world of hop culture. That is, the people that were associated with the culture of hops, nor the distribution and marketing and banking and anything else that was going on in the transfer of the crops, to say nothing of the brewing and how it is that it works its way into the beer that you drink. Right? Yuba County was important from the point of view of a dissertation, but it didn't really merit, as it turns out in my book, but one little itty-bitty footnote, right? Because Yuba County was then put in a different context. My role in writing the book was different than the dissertation. You're looking at previous works, large or small, is going to be different, right? And you have to parse them, pick them apart, use what pieces are useful, and go on, right? So that you can differentiate what is different in your work as opposed to what is similar, right? And that will come naturally. If you actually fill out this thesis proposal worksheet and do it for a project, you'll be about, well, I won't say, but roughly, it would be about 5% of the amount of work necessary to complete a research project. Because the questions are so direct, but you have to provide the information, right? And it's really helpful then to keep these in mind as you move forward. How will your proposed study be a contribution to the literature or whatever else is believed? On item 8, what literature have you not examined that will be important for you to consider, right? And it could be any number of things that occur to you as you get into your literature, right? What types of data or information are needed for investigating, particularly defining categories or classifications. And that leads to where we spent a few minutes just a moment ago, where we were on a different thesis sheet, when we think about the research strategies or methods that are appropriate, right? You define now in this worksheet what it is that you see in the literature you will review that would be the most appropriate to do what you intend to do, right? And then you ask, why are these methods appropriate? See, what I'm doing here is I'm providing you with all the questions that your thesis advisor is inevitably going to ask. These are all basically crib notes, right? They're crib notes for you to accelerate through the process at your own speed, right? Because you're thinking about it for yourselves, right? You wouldn't be here if you weren't bright enough to get admitted. I've got to assume that you've gone through classes enough that you can assemble the material. It's not really rocket science to me because I've been through it. This is an attempt to demystify it for you. What skills, training, or experience do you now possess to pursue these data collection strategies? What steps, if any, do you plan to take to compensate for deficiencies? And then on the third page, where do you plan to collect your data? Again, accessibility to archival sources, survey samples, research sites, people as the case may be with respect to their availability. Because as you move through this worksheet, you'll see that it begins to frame the time you need to spend in various locations. Your physical person has to be outside of your nest for certain periods of time, gathering material. Where are these chestnuts that you're going to get? Right? And then what, if any, obstacles do you foresee in gaining, any kind of access to this stuff? How do you plan to finance your research, if finance is a necessary concern? What do you think will be the significance or importance of your study to existing policy, program development, or project execution? If your project of any kind is going to have a chance of being implemented, this question becomes key, right? So that you know that you've thought about it. It becomes part of what it is that you discuss, you answer in your work. And then how will the characteristics of your study influence future work? Now, then going to the last few handy thesis notes, there is a relationship between your preliminary outline as a tool to organize your thoughts and the content of your thesis. You should be able to see that the content, a table of contents is reflected or begins to be reflected as you begin in your preliminary outline. And some writers begin by creating a detailed outline with subtitles. That's one way which the textbooks would tell you, writing textbooks will tell you. You essentially do an outline and you fill in the blanks, basically, somewhat like the template, right? And you move through it from beginning to end. The British, particularly, you'll see British scientific authors often resort to this technique. The outline is very specific. 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4a, 1.4b, 1.4, and you know, you've seen text